double-edged federalism, and the idea behind the panel is to sort of explore both the good and the bad and also the deep complexity of our decentralized system of elections. We have four fantastic presenters who I will introduce briefly right now. Jake Grumbach is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Washington and a faculty associate with the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies. His book, Laboratories-of-Democracy, was released earlier this year. Jessica Bulman-Pozen is the Betts Professor of Law and a director of the Center for Constitutional Governance at Columbia Law School. She's an expert on administrative law and constitutional law and has written extensively about federalism. Kevin Kosar is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies the United States Congress, the administrative state, American politics, election reform, and the Postal Service. His most recent book is Congress Overwhelmed: The Decline in Congressional Capacity and Prospects for Reform. And finally, Carolyn Shapiro is a professor of law and associate dean for academic administration and strategic initiatives at Chicago-Kent College of Law, where she is also the founder and co-director of Chicago-Kent's Institute on the Supreme Court of the United States and the faculty director of the Constitutional Democracy Project. So each of our presenters will present, and then I will ask a few questions, and then we will open things up to audience questions. And Jake, can we start with you?
Sounds great.
Great.
Thanks, Justin. All right. Thank you, Justin, for the introduction and running the panel. Thanks so much to Carolyn and ISIS for all the huge work behind the scenes for this conference. I have a PowerPoint, so I think it'll come up. I am super happy to be here. I'm maybe I'm covertly like infiltrating as a non-lawyer here. I'm just a humble quantitative social scientist who I think a lot of my scholarly identity is taking a lot of your arguments and theories and putting equations and Greek symbols over it. So thank you so much for that. It's made my career. The other thing is now I'm an associate professor, so with tenure I'm gonna be a little more wild, which is great. Thanks so much for having me. Titling this talk Laboratories of Democratic Backsliding, which is a sort of paper version of, I think, the business third of my book, Laboratories Against Democracy. So this project overall is on the ongoing crisis of American democracy and crisis of multiracial democracy. And it was just wonderful to have Rick kick this off with a discussion of sort of the potential threats and precarious state that institutional decentralization may put American politics and political institutions in. So a huge amount of focus has been, as you all know, on the executive branch and the federal government with respect to threats to democracy. But as we know, due to US constitutional structure and election administration, districting, and even beyond that, issues like police power being authorities at the state level, we have to look to the states to see where democracy lives and dies in the US. So I think what I'm most known for in this book is quantitatively measuring electoral democratic performance in the states over the past few decades. In this quantitative measure, what I do is I collect a huge amount of data on states, data capturing how responsive state policy is to public opinion in the states, the cost of voting in the states, the fairness of legislative districting, and new, as you guys know, new statistical measures of partisan and racial fairness in districting maps, and finally, policies and procedures around electoral integrity and security. And what you see over time is that the average state actually stays pretty static over this time period, right? And if we were thinking just nationally, that would seem to be fine, right? You know, the average state is doing okay. Right? But as we know in other periods, such as during Jim Crow or slavery, to say, oh, the average state is not too segregated, that wouldn't make a ton of sense. And there's really key vulnerabilities at the state level, as Rick just mentioned. So what I observe over time using this measure, and I do a ton of statistical mumbo jumbo to really demonstrate that this is not just my hunch. This is I'm trying to, under a wide series of different normative assumptions about how to weight different considerations in electoral democracy. You see that some states are chugging along pretty well. Washington State remains a leader in that dotted line. Some states a bit below the median, like Texas. There's some fluctuations across time, but overall stay pretty steady. And then you have a series of states that undergo really dramatic democratic backsliding over this time period. And here I'm picking out in the solid line, for example, North Carolina, which was really a leader since the demise of Jim Crow in North Carolina in the 1970s and expanding access to the franchise. Electoral competition was increasing, turnout skyrocketing, a leader in implementing the Motor Voter Act in the early 1990s and registering individuals through the DMV. But after 2010, you see a really precipitous decline in its democratic performance as it sets mathematical records for partisan imbalance in districting, engages in what we know as sort of voter suppression policies, among other things. So explaining that variation within states across time is central to this book. And as sort of Rick, I think, alluded to but didn't get into, one key part of this is the nationalization of the political parties and how the nationalization of the party coalitions has collided with the decentralized institutions of American democracy in the US Constitution. So during Jim Crow, right, huge threats to democracy, right, mass disenfranchisement in the US South, but this was a time of a decentralized party system where Northern and Southern Democrats were highly distinct on their attitudes and performance towards electoral democracy, right? This sort of, while I'd say electoral democracy was, the differences between Jim Crow and non-Jim Crow states in electoral democracy is wider back then than the distinctions between, say, North Carolina and Washington State or Colorado now, a high-performing state, right? Much broader in the past. The difference is the sort of interaction of these national party coalitions. Here you see divergence between states controlled entirely by Democrats in blue, divided states where the governorship and one legislative chamber controlled by different parties in green, and finally, unified Republican states in red. What you find here is that the interaction of national parties and decentralized electoral institutions really does, I think, exacerbate the risk to sort of system-wide failure, as Rick really eloquently put it in his talk. One implication that I've more recently looked at for policy outcomes and sort of democratic responsiveness in the states post-Dobbs decision is here, Chris Warshaw, another political scientist, and I, we estimated public opinion on abortion policy, on full abortion bans in the states, and then we plotted essentially what percentage of a state's public agrees with the likely or impending post-Roe abortion policy in the states. You see a large number of states in red that are poised to or already have essentially banned abortion have pro-choice majorities, right? They're below majority support for these abortion bans, but the reason these states are able to get away with policies that are not responsive to median opinion is insulation due to gerrymandering. So my democratic sort of performance measure and measures of gerrymandering very strongly predict state policies that are out of step with voter majorities in those states. So I think these are long-term, prior to the sort of really acute threat of electoral subversion in 2024, long-term sort of changes in electoral democratic performance in the states really do sort of distort representation at all levels. The rest of my book engages with broader theories. Now I'm moving to the sort of the broader theories that I've really drawn upon folks like you here. But going back, to the Federalist Papers and beyond, there's been a huge amount of conventional wisdom support for institutional decentralization as protective and advantageous for American democracy. But what I'm showing quantitatively in this book is that many of those favorable theories of decentralization and democracy fall away in the presence of these nationally polarized and coordinated parties. But traditional theories suggest that lower levels of government will be more responsive to public opinion of constituents than, distant fat cats in DC, as your state legislative candidate might call them, right? But what I find is precisely the opposite. Similarly, decentralization might reduce national conflict and polarization, right? The idea that, we have really contentious issues over, trans rights or reproductive rights, that really divide the country nearly 50-50. And, really the temperature of those conflicts really increases when those policy conflicts are nationalized, is the argument. I find, again, that sort of theory has fallen away empirically. The idea that you can vote with your feet and exit a state where you don't like the policies happening in your state or locality, that also is increasingly used by especially well-resourced individuals and groups who can exercise threat of exit from their jurisdiction, large taxpayers, firms, so forth, put states and cities in competition to essentially provide the most tax breaks or to, fail to regulate these groups and things like that. Ordinary voters don't have this capacity to say, policy's been changing in a way I don't like in my state. I'm going to leave my family and social network and job and pack up and move. Highly unequal threat of exit. The idea that policy experimentation, Louis Brandeis's laboratories of democracy idea, states are going to provide 50 laboratories, reject the failed experiments, emulate the good experiments that succeed. Right now, states only emulate states that are controlled by the same political party in terms of policy learning. And if there ever was an association between sort of policy success, electorally or economically, and emulation between states, right, that has fallen away over the past generation of nationalized political parties. And then what we're talking about today is the Madisonian idea of double security, right? When a tyrant is poised to take national power, right, isn't it great that we have these separate state and county election administrations? Rick did a pretty good job with that already so far. In my book, so I engage in these arguments theoretically and empirically, mostly with statistics. But again, in terms of laboratories of democracy, states are now partisan laboratories of democracy. Blue Minnesota is not looking to red Wisconsin after the financial crisis and saying, what can we learn about how to rehire public sector workers and things like that after a financial crisis? What can we learn about successful election administration? That does not happen across states, even in similar geographies, demographies, political histories. The security trade-off of institutional electoral administration decentralization here. So very important to not, as a would-be autocrat is in national power, you don't want to centralize all authority under their jurisdiction right then. But over long stretches of time, I'm arguing, changes and democratic backsliding in the states, because states administer elections constitutionally from local dog catcher up to, president and the feds, this really does matter, and states can shape the particular electorates that come out to vote, shape House districts, shape the balance of power nationally in ways that sort of amplify the representational distortions and inequality at lower levels of government. Finally, these large advantages for more wealthier and concentrated interests, ironically, at lower levels of government rather than higher levels. So the decline of state and local journalism over the past generation with the rise of Craigslist and the internet, destruction of classified ad revenue, rise of media conglomerates like Sinclair Media and local TV stations. Coverage is much more national. We all know how to vote in presidential primaries. I have a PhD in political science. I have no idea how to vote in my state legislative primary without relying on national groups, right? That increases the information asymmetry between wealthy organizations who know how to deal with the fine print of state legislation and reduces the capacity for ordinary voters to hold politicians at the state and local level accountable, in contrast to Congress and the presidency. Finally, groups now in this nationalized partisan context, groups that have mobile political resources can move, for example, money across states to advantageous political moments like a wave election of 2010, implement a broad policy agenda, whereas ordinary voters or social movements or, workers in labor unions or some other groups that are based in sort of mass-based constituencies, they're much less mobile and they're tied to their state and local jurisdiction in a way that does not allow them to take advantage of sort of fertile political moments across the country as more advantaged groups can. Overall, super happy to be here. Looking forward to some Q&A. Thanks very much. Oh, yeah, thanks.
I knew if I was following a political scientist, I had to have a PowerPoint as well, so I did my best here. And let me echo Jake's thanks to our organizers for having us at this conference and all the work that's gone into it. It's really a pleasure, if also a nightmare at the same time, to be here. So when I was asked to think about double-edged federalism in the electoral context, I thought mostly about differences across states, and as Jake has so nicely illuminated, and as we've begun to discuss already, those loom large in this conversation. But what I wanted to do actually in this brief 10 minutes here is to think about double-edged federalism within the state, and to think about how focusing on different state institutions might lead us to think a little differently about both the threat at the state level and also some of the resources that are available within a particular state to combat the threat. So my claim in brief, with some clip art here, is going to be that some of the most serious threats to our electoral system today, threats of electoral sabotage, are coming from state legislatures, and that by contrast, state courts, in particular state courts enforcing state constitutions, are particularly well positioned to help combat this threat. So I want to just at the outset temper this claim to say certainly state legislatures are not the only threat, as Rick already walked us through. Risks of political violence still loom large. Risks of election deniers taking up critical executive branch positions like secretaries of state loom very large. And likewise, I don't want to suggest that courts are any sort of panacea. We see courts failing to rise to the challenge and in fact engaging in some quite bad rulings as well. But the basic claim is that as electoral sabotage has moved sort of into the mainstream agenda of certain political actors, we now see it being furthered through state legislative action that looks very normal and very routine, and yet is quite insidious. And so we have state legislatures, especially I think often in states that are in the color scheme purple, but have red legislatures that don't really trust the people of the state to vote for how they will want them to vote, enacting all sorts of different laws, some of which are quite concerning and already on the books, and others are being considered right now. So among these are power shifting laws, as I would call them, including the one Richard mentioned in his colloquy with Rick in Georgia, a sort of counterpoint to the stateizing as a good thing, where the state legislature is trying to move control from local administrators to the state level, but in part so as to centralize it with respect to the legislature choosing the control of that board. So we have both a sort of centralization mechanism, but also a legislative control mechanism with respect to the running of those elections. Here in Arizona, there's a bill pending, as you probably know, that would assign the states to at-large presidential electors to the candidate favored by the legislature rather than the candidate favored by the voter. That's not a law yet, but legislatures are considering these sorts of changes and often talking about them in terms of values we associate with rule of law, transparency, good government, accountability. That's also the relevant point with respect to sham audits of the sort we've seen in Arizona and we've seen in Wisconsin that are designed really as phony kinds of undertakings to sow doubt not only about the past election, the 2020 election, but also future elections. And we also have laws that are criminalizing or threatening to criminalize various aspects of the electoral process, things like threatening criminal prosecution for changing filing dates, the kinds of actions that election administrators might normally undertake in good faith to try to make elections run, and that we saw, especially during the COVID era, to try to make elections function in this particularly difficult context, now being subject to criminal threat, right? So there are many more examples, right? But this edge of the sword, so to speak, of the double-edged federalism is the capture of normal state lawmaking processes to subvert elections rather than simply political violence, not simply, I don't mean to minimize it, but risks to the electoral system that come from outside of the system. The other edge, though, is that, and here, although my fonts are not coming through, so sorry, I'm not a graphic designer, but so hopefully you can still see Miriam Seifter's name there, my wonderful co-author, Miriam, and I have written a longer version of these remarks with respect to the constitutional claim, which is that state constitutions, unlike their federal counterpart, and in a really distinctive way, include a commitment to democracy, to democratic principles, that is really robust, and that if it's properly understood, both by the people of the states, but also in this case by the courts of the states, could go a long way in this context to stopping electoral subversion, and in other contexts to helping American democracy writ large, right? So again, the focus on state courts is largely because of their institutional role with respect to state constitutions, but the constitutions themselves are worth a much closer look. Again, we associate constitutions mostly with the federal constitution and the lockstepping that has often happened as state courts interpret their constitutions in light of the federal constitution. But a closer look at state constitutions shows that they are just shot through with a commitment to democracy. This is true of all 50 constitutions, although they manifest it in somewhat different ways, right? So we have as just a few examples, right? All of the state constitutions, except for New York's, my home state, contain an express commitment to popular sovereignty, to rule by the people, and not just in the sort of aspirational preamble, the we the people kind of language we may associate with aspiration, but not actually a commitment that can be effectuated. Here in the state constitutions, we have these commitments to popular sovereignty, to rule by the people in the operative text of the constitutions themselves. We also, in state constitutions, in a way that Josh Douglas has written very nicely about, have right to vote included in the constitutions, as well as other relevant provisions like commitments to free and equal or free and open elections. And we have a variety of other provisions that focus on representation and democracy and lawmaking beyond legislatures. State constitutions, through the ways they have been amended over time, particularly in the 19th century, express a skepticism about, or a concern at least, about ways in which state legislatures may fail to represent the people, may not actually function as representative institutions. And so there are a number of mechanisms by which we have in a number of states, for example, Arizona, direct democracy that just allows circumvention of the legislature, but also with respect to the legislature itself, limits on how the legislature is composed, limits on how the legislature functions, that are designed and could be effectuated over time in ways that try to ensure the legislature is carrying out the will of the people rather than subverting it, right? So state courts, as I noted at the outset, have not always and are not now always reliably interpreting and guaranteeing these provisions against forms of legislative or other undermining. But they really are in a good position to do so, and we have some examples in recent years as this legislative role in subverting elections or threatening to subvert elections has become more dominant, of state courts attempting, and in some cases succeeding in stopping such measures. So just last week, I believe it was, we see the state courts in Montana invalidating legislative measures that would have barred same-day election registration and prohibited the use of student IDs. We've seen anti-gerrymandering holdings across the country, including in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. The Idaho Supreme Court has intervened to stop the state legislature from trying to withdraw from the people the power of initiative and a referendum. So there's a whole variety of challenges that have been brought, some of which have succeeded across the country. And again, without placing undue faith in the courts, I think that the tenor of this conference is somewhat gloomy, and rightly so. I think it's also wrong to ignore them and to ignore the potential that state courts can present in this area, especially when we look inside the states to see what state courts are doing. I guess to end on maybe an even more gloomy note, I think this distinction between legislatures and courts also really underscores the serious stakes that are probably already apparent, but with respect to the Moore versus Harper case and the independent state legislature theory, insofar as the Supreme Court may, by placing a thumb on the scale, erroneously, I think from a federal constitutional perspective, but also disastrously with respect to the internal allocation of power within the states this fall by elevating legislatures and reducing the ability of courts to do anything about that, as Carolyn, among others, has written so nicely about the flaws of that theory with respect to the federal constitution, but paying attention to the problems with respect to state legislative and judicial roles, I think, is also another important feature of that ongoing debate. So maybe 2 cheers for state courts. All right.
That was great.
You can just use mine.
I'll just use it. All right. Well, so much for my ability to do a mic drop after I say something profound. That's not going to happen. Well, more good cheer to spread, having had so much sunshine shared so far. So I should say as a preface, I wrote a little essay, about 1,800 words, just a small thing that I'll share with the folks who organized the conference in a little bit that has the title Elections, Federalism, and the Peril of a Partisan Race to a Bottom. So how's that for cheer? And I would be delighted if any of you could take time to take a peek at it and give me some feedback on it. Yeah, you heard I'm at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm a political scientist by training. My work the last couple of years on elections has really concentrated on Electoral Count Act. I was one of the many people who even before the November 2020 election was saying, like, we might be in for a rough ride. In fact, scholars have been saying this, particularly legal scholars have been saying this for 30 years. But of course, Congress, being as it is, tends not to act upon such things until the last possible moment, or not at all. My other work has also been kind of a little more broad conceptual in trying to think about how can we structure elections so that we produce winning candidates who have strong incentives to govern. I've been in Washington, D.C. for 20 years, and I've found it very troubling that it seems like more and more people are coming into town as representatives or senators, and less of them seem interested in doing the grubby, hard work of being a legislator in a mass pluralistic society. Other incentives seem to be overwhelming their intentions. So that's kind of the perspective I brought when I was asked to come here and talk about, federalism, double-edged sword. And as I was chewing this over, my brain slipped into thinking of things in terms of game theory. I'm not a game theorist by training, that's for sure. Not even close, but I got plenty of it back in grad school. And I think I came to thinking in those terms because it's my observation that when I have been observing the jockeying, the machinations around elections policy and elections administration, the sheer ruthlessness of it. There may be principles and pleasant words, but God, this is just a vicious scrum for power. And it's a vicious scrum for both short-term power and for the more clever ones for long-term power, for perpetuating the higher probabilities that one party or the other might win. So when you see if you take a look at my little paper, that's the kind of theoretic I use. It's not cheerful. It's not cheerful on that count. There are good people in our election system, and we've relied heavily upon them, and part of why we got through January 6th is because we had sufficient good people, people of conscience, people of duty, who did their jobs. Now, Rick's presentation was great, and the follow-ups to it, I love it. I mean, the way things are just speaking exactly to where you kind of laid down the breadcrumbs. A federal system, I love it. I think our federal system of picking members of Congress and presidents has worked pretty darn well. We've had some spectacular messes, 1876, 2020. But I think it's gone pretty well. But yeah, absolutely, it inherently has challenges. I mean, this is a system that is yoking together disparate entities in pursuit of a collective good. And by nature, there's always going to be tensions between the individual unit and what they see as advantageous for themselves, either short-term or long-term, and the temptation to, using game theory, to defect. And that can create negative costs upon other states, or it can scuttle national objectives, like stopping somebody from becoming president who was legitimately elected. Now, it's interesting that in our Constitution, the founders weren't oblivious to this stuff. I mean, there were things that they simply took away from the states, under this same sort of perilous logic of how do you have good collective action. States aren't allowed to sign treaties with foreign nations for mutual defense. They can't, coin their own money, impose duties on shipments arriving at their ports. There's any number of things that the founders wisely took away because they knew it would just lead to a wreck. They learned that under the Articles of Confederation, I mean. But elections, they left with the states, and we're living with that legacy. And again, I think it's gone pretty well, but I feel like we are under some really severe strains. January 6th was a very clear example. We've seen some of the things that are happening at the state level where parties are nakedly changing policies to stack the deck in their favor. And even in the House of Representatives, much attention was on post-January 6th, but in the House of Representatives, we had 2 contested elections. Losing candidates in Illinois and Iowa appealed to the Committee on House Administration and said that they had lost inappropriately, that the election was conducted in ways that were unfair to them. And the Committee on House Administration, very interestingly, is one of the committees in the House that has a severe partisan imbalance. Presently, there are way more Dems than Republicans on it. And so that was entirely possible that if they just wanted to take a naked partisan vote, they could have overturned 2 state elections. There's nothing to stop this from happening in the future. And that's where we're at right now. And the question is well, wait a minute, the Constitution has been what it is for all this time, and why are we in this intense period of craziness? Well, arguably, we went through something like this in the late 19th century, and then we were able to tamp things down through a number of means. But we're back here again, and I think why we're here is, number one, as you alluded to, nationalization of political parties and the self-sorting that's happened. We have way more independent voters these days, people who have no interest in signing up with either parties. 76% of Ohioans, that's my home state, they choose not to be on either party. But those who sign up, by gum, they're in. And so we've got red shirts and blue shirts vying more intensely than ever before. My friend Lee Drutman likes to point out that we've always had a 2-party system, yet it was 2 parties that were actually 4. Liberal Democrats, conservative Democrats, liberal Republicans, conservative Republicans. Those days are long gone. So we've got that. And as political scientist Francis Lee points out, in terms of competition for Congress, the competition between the 2 parties to win seats and control the chambers is more severe than it has been since, again, the late 19th century. And when you use that as your context, intense partisan political competition for power, you can see why this federal system is starting to strain. Because neither party is able to have a long-term majority simply on the merits. The public just doesn't like them enough. Dems take the House, then Dems lose the House. Republicans take the Senate, they lose the Senate. It goes back and forth. So unsurprisingly, unable to lock in their victories through pushing good policy and doing other sorts of stuff, they're turning their attention to rigging the system. And both parties have an incentive to tilt things in ways that they think are their favor. So I likened it in my little essay to a prisoner's dilemma, where you have high mutual distrust between the 2 parties, aka the 2 prisoners, and instead of being able to say we're willing to compete within the confines of the current law with, some leaning on making, things that could help us in one way or another, they're just all in. It's all-out warfare, and the gloves are off, and they are going to change the rules as hard as possible. And that's the logic of the conflict, and that's where we get to the kind of last part of the title of my paper, which is these sorts of things do not seem amenable to stoppage through the logic of tit for tat. You punch me in the nose, I punch you back in the nose, we both have headaches, and we walk away. Right now, it seems like it's just feeding on itself. And what I worry, you had your red state, blue state up there, the sortation of those states' election systems progressively into systems that more and more favor one party over the other and create permanent majorities within them. And how is that going to bleed up into Congress, which is supposed to pass national laws for all of us, recognized as legitimate, to say nothing of selecting the president? God, that's gloomy. But the one thing that the game theoretic, helped me see is that there are ways to kind of mess with incentives to better the situation, to create costs, benefits, to de-escalate. It's very underdeveloped in this, but I'll just say as one quick plug, I had the pleasure of working with the Bipartisan Policy Center and some other groups in Washington, D.C. Over the last year and a half, and one of the things we put out earlier this year was a bipartisan federal framework. And the logic behind this framework was, let's create a grants and aid program, and let's allow states to apply to it so that they can adopt certain basic standards. whether it's ballot access stuff, ballot security, cybersecurity, that sort of stuff. You know, the weakest link. Let's see if we can professionalize some of these places a bit more, dangle the federal money to it. And maybe in doing that, we can take some of the dirty plays out of the book. You know, the same way NFL took out clotheslining and horse collar tackles and other things that are just hideously mutually destructive in the long run. Of course, it was ignored on Capitol Hill. But suffice to say, when I see the parties going at it this hard, and I try to think about it in those terms, the de-escalation question is first and foremost on my mind. And if anyone has ideas about how we can do that, God, I'd love to hear them. Thank you.
Well, I don't have slides either, so you'll just have to look at me for the next 10 minutes. I'm really happy to be on this panel, and thank you to the organizers for the hard work and the invitations. I really, really appreciate it. But I'm particularly happy to be on this panel because the title, Double-Edged Federalism, actually, I think, encapsulates what is arguably a tension in my own writing and thinking and scholarship in two of my most recent articles. So I have an article about the guarantee clause, which is a clause, Rick, you left out in your list of clauses that Congress can rely on. And in that piece, I argue in favor of congressional regulation of democratic processes in the states, and actually that goes further than the Article 1, Article 2, and the various different voting amendments. For example, I argue in favor of the Congress regulating extreme partisan gerrymandering in state legislatures as well as in Congress under the guarantee clause. And of course, I'd be happy to talk about that at length. On the other hand, my most recent piece, which is forthcoming, is about the independent state legislature theory. And in there, I argue that the independent state legislature theory, as it is being, at least as it is in practice, being just sort of rolled out, I guess, or potentially rolled out, is an improper federal judicial intrusion on state law and constitutional structures. So in my own mind, I thought, am I being inconsistent? Well, I don't think I am. And here's why. I think that rather than focusing on sort of formal questions of, well, when does the federal government intervene, and even which branch of the federal government is allowed to intervene, I think when we think about federalism and its and whether or not it is and what its purposes are, it is intimately related to robust representative democracy. And what we end up having, given when we have a highly formalistic approach to federalism instituted by the Supreme Court, is an approach that doesn't actually serve those purposes, at least when that approach is applied specifically to rules and laws about democracy. And in that way, which I will explain, but in that way I think it's importantly different from the way federalism doctrine operates in some other areas of law, like the anti-commandeering doctrine, the anti-coercion doctrine, the 11th Amendment litany of cases that limit congressional power to have different types of control over state governments. One can think those cases are wrong or right. I tend to think they're wrong, but I don't think that they have the same effect on the underlying principles of federalism and representative democracy. So I'm going to talk about sort of three different justifications for federalism and why I think they require robust representative democracy. And some of this I think will be kind of obvious. The first justification is the one that I think we've all heard over and over and over again, especially when Justice Kennedy and Justice O'Connor were on the bench. Federalism secures to citizens the liberties that derive from the diffusion of sovereign power, right? This idea that these two sovereigns are going to save us from tyranny. And that because of that, right, that's so important to protect state sovereignty and state from federal intrusion. This has led to an approach, a doctrinal approach that's really very formalistic, right? When is the intrusion too much? And it's focused heavily on what the Supreme Court often refers to as sovereign dignity of the states. The problem with this, of course, in the context of democracy, is that state sovereignty has not yielded consistent results with respect to liberty, as we all know, at least not liberty for everyone, right? Slavery, Jim Crow. I'm not going to go into more detail. I'm sure you are all familiar with the litany. And so when the Supreme Court has failed to connect this idea of sovereignty and liberty to, or federalism to liberty, it has actually undermined that kind of liberty. And we can see that as recently as Shelby County, but it goes back, right? We can see it in Giles versus Harris, in which the Supreme Court basically shrugged its shoulders and said, well, if the people of Arkansas don't want the black folks who live among them, who I guess weren't part of the people, they don't have to let them vote, even despite the 15th Amendment. So in this sense, the independent state legislature theory is in fact particularly dangerous. It's very formalistic, right? It's all based on this one word in Article 1 and in Article 2, the word legislature. There's very little other basis for the ISLT, and I can talk about the ISLT all day, which I've been doing all summer. So I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A if people want. But what it does is it undermines the state commitments to representative democracy that Jessica was talking about, that Miriam has written about, and that is, it should be a central part of our commitment to federalism. Secondly, we have federalism as laboratories of democracy, which we've already heard about as well. There's lots of good explanations for what's positive about that vision, but there too, without robust representative democracy, those benefits are undermined. Obviously, they're undermined within the states themselves. They're undermined, as Jake was describing, in the ability of states to actually learn from each other's experiments. But they're also undermined because, as some federalism scholars have argued, one of the positives of federalism, this is one of Heather Gerken's big points, is that we have these sort of policy spillovers where we all kind of have to live with policies we might not love next door, but that gives us practice, right? It gives us practice in living in a democracy. If the policies that are being put in place next door are being put in place through processes that people can't trust as being actually part of a representative democracy, they have much less basis for actually engaging in that exercise, engaging in that toleration. And this can lead to, and this is one of the things I talk about in my guarantee clause work, is the kind of anti-democratic tit-for-tat spiral, where one state does one thing and a state controlled by another party does another thing. Just to be very concrete, right when Rucho came to the Supreme Court, it was North Carolina, heavily gerrymandered by the Republican legislature. The companion case from Maryland, which involved a gerrymandered congressional district by the Democratic Party, the governor of Maryland said, well, if they're going to do it, I'm going to do it, right? That was part of his justification for having done that. So here, too, the formalism that sort of undermines the representative democracy actually undermines federalism's very benefits. Then there's a third thing I want to say about federalism. When I teach con law, and I'm doing this, sort of talking about the founding, I always have to say to my students, they're the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists at the beginning. And what they wanted were actually, what the Federalists wanted is kind of different from when we talk about federalism today and people who believe in federalism today. It's like the opposite. But it's not, I don't think we should overlook the role of federalism as actually preserving and creating some level of national cohesion. And in fact, since the founding, we have an increasingly cohesive nation, even despite with all of our current struggles. We've seen this with the aftermath of the Civil War itself, but also things like the way technology has helped us create a national economy, the way migration has helped people have moved from other countries to be here, from within the country. People are, in general, think of themselves as Americans first and perhaps Virginians second. And an increasing recognition, as we see through all the amendments, the voting amendments and the Voting Rights Act, et cetera, that nationhood requires compatible governments between the states. And that doesn't mean they all have to be the same, but they all have to be, I think, meaningfully democratic. So in the end, what I would argue is that we can't rely on a structure alone to save democracy, right? We can't rely on federalism alone, or we can't rely on Congress or the court. What we really have to go back to are the principles behind why we have a federalist system. And at this moment in time, I think that leads us to Congress as the place to at least try, although we all know what Congress's pathologies are, to try to get some movement. The Supreme Court, on the other hand, appears poised to continue its extraordinarily formalistic and, in my view, extremely destructive of democracy approach to these questions. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for those remarks. We're all quite gloomy, but actually, I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about being gloomy about the right thing, or being gloomy about a particular thing. So I used to think about federalism as kind of the search for good actors and bad actors, and in some circumstances, it's clear who the good actors are and who the bad actors are. So in the civil rights era, the feds were coming in with, the Civil Rights Act, right, and enforcing federal law against states that were segregating their societies. I've sort of now come to the understanding that there are good actors everywhere and there are bad actors everywhere. But in part, what I see all of your projects as doing, and I think maybe also Rick's project, is looking for a good actor, right? So for Carolyn, the good actor is Congress.
Could be.
Could be Congress. For Kevin, I think Kevin maybe doesn't see a good actor.
No.
I'm not entirely sure. Right. Jessica's good actor is state courts, perhaps, possibly. Jake, I think your good actor isn't states.
Right, I'm with Carolyn.
With Carolyn. Okay, great. And I'm wondering whether, and so there's actually a really interesting sort of way in which separation of powers is also creeping up here into our conversation about federalism, which I think isn't surprising in some ways. What I'm wondering is, are we all searching for a vanishingly small good actor, given that we're coming up against a political party where, as Rick mentions, the base of the political party just won't tolerate sort of truth when it comes to questions about elections. And I think, Rick, for you, the good actor is this federal commission, right? But in some ways, that also relies on Congress to appoint, or to the court to appoint. So there's a sense in which, generally, the federal government sort of would be the good actor here. But sort of, given that we can't count on both political parties to participate in creating these good actors, are we sort of searching for a vanishingly small good actor? Are there maybe sort of no good actors here? Or is it sort of a fool's errand to be thinking about who a good actor is? Is it possibly even predictable?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. That's pretty gloomy. But I mean, one thing, actually, Rick and I were saying to each other outside, like, what is our option? I mean, there are objections we can make, or we can point to the potential roadblocks in all of our different attempts to try to enhance or save our democracy. But what else are we going to do? And I think the insistence that there are still, even if things don't go, I have no idea what's going to happen in 2022 or 2024, but I tend to think that there will, even I hope, in the worst case scenarios, there are still places where, even if it's not national, there are places where we will still have meaningful democracy, and that over time, I hope, hopefully in my lifetime, we will be able to expand that. I don't know. I mean, but I don't really see that. I could give it all up, but I don't think we have a choice but to look for the good actors.
I shook my head and said that, no on good actors. That's not fair. No, I think, all those folks who behaved honorably and did their jobs, I mean, we should be singing their names from the rooftops and celebrating them and encouraging more people who firmly believe that when you take an oath, that oath means something, that you're not just mouthing pretty words. And that when times get tough, it takes character to stand up and avoid the kind of partisan hassles. And I think we could probably make their lives a bit easier if they're elections administrators by extending some sort of federal protections to them. You have these small elections administrations, they got 3 people, they got 5 people, they got 8 people employed there. Like, what are they going to do when somebody starts spamming them with 10,000 emails, threatening their lives or whatever sort of stuff is going on? Like, these folks need help. We can buck them up and make it easier for them to not get plowed over and sucked into caving to the incentives. But that said, I think, this being such a tough combat between 2 heavily sorted parties has just led to a situation where we need to look for these things to be kind of negotiated pieces. And I think one reason we're seeing the Electoral Count Act getting so close to being amended is because one thing that was pointed out very early on is that you don't know who's going to be sitting in the presiding officer's chair next time around. It could be the other party member. And do you really want, Kamala Harris to just say, Georgia, Texas, I've heard of irregularities. I'm setting these votes aside. Well, that's one way I've terrified my Republican friends is by putting that in front of them. And it's a real threat. I mean, if we're going to go there, both parties recognize that this is going to get super, super bad. And they've both pulled back and kind of realized, like, we got to cut a deal on this. So it's not high principles, it's not morals. I'm sure there's some of that involved, but it's the pain and consequences that might suffer. They might suffer. That's kind of encouraging them to draw a truce.
Well, I mean, I'll likewise endorse the, not first best, but, at best, sort of second best kind of theory that we're engaging in here, and what alternatives do we have. But I guess I just want to say also, I mean, I think the idea of having a double-edged federalism or having a federal system that we're reflecting on, combined also with a separation of power system at both the federal level and the state level, one of the ongoing and sort of for all times features of that is that we have multiple different sites of power that can be configured in different ways. And so as we move away because of our extremely polarized, nationalized parties, in particular from an idea that states are certainly acting in a particular way versus the federal government, and we see partisan alignments across state and federal government, across particular actors in state and federal government, we have to move away from the categories of state or federal. But if we think about the particular actors within the states, particular actors within the federal government, we're going to come up with better or worse configurations of power or better or worse sorts of systems of checks and balances. And so I think thinking about that is our obligation, even if the answers aren't always pretty, and they're certainly not easy.
Yeah, no, these are great lead-ins. I think I just want to double down on Carolyn's point that Congress is really the only hope and consistently has been through American history. The correlation is very clear looking at this. The Supreme Court enables state variation in sort of democracy. Whether that's the initiation of Jim Crow or, laws around slavery or whatnot. States decide to do that, often take that opportunity to do so. A good handful of states do. And then Congress decides either to step in and establish federal baselines or not. It almost never is actively engaged in democratic backsliding, but rather the sin of, whatever. Sits on its hands. That was a total Bushism. That was great. So there, Congress is, again, we don't have perfect theoretical mechanisms of why that pattern has been so consistent. And there are, of course, really new things about this threat now, but this is pretty clear. But then I want to pick up on Kevin's really important prisoner's dilemma point. The prisoner's dilemma, so unfortunately, the econometric equilibrium is defect. Both parties defect and snitch in a prisoner's dilemma. But the point overall in a lot of other prisoner's dilemma varieties where the payoffs aren't quite so extreme for, snitching and defecting in the original prisoner's dilemma, cooperation is sustained by symmetric threat of punishment. So we have to deal with, unfortunately, the asymmetry in terms of partisan adherence to norms and punishment around those norms. This is a hard thing as a quant social scientist. How do you say, well, one party has done different performance towards norms with Supreme Court seats or gerrymandering in states. Right now, we see when the threat of punishment for norm violations, like legal partisan gerrymandering happens, and one side is engaged in it in a much more extreme way. When the Democrats engaged in much more gerrymandering before the New York court threw out the New York Democratic gerrymander, the Republican Party suddenly was much more interested in a national gerrymandering ban, right? Like, this is, I actually think there's a weird, we're in an especially acute problem because we don't have symmetric threat of norm-based punishment, where one party is like slightly, I don't know, ideologically committed to old style. I'm not exactly sure, but I do think actually engaging in greater symmetry of the threat of punishment for norm violation may ironically bring us to more cooperation, as Kevin kind of started that discussion. I think that's an area of hope potentially. And there can be like institutional learning, and you know, people like you are all providing that kind of institutional learning for what, you know, elite decision making would produce that sort of incentive structure.
Great, thank you. I'm happy to ask more questions, but actually I think we should open it up to the audience. It's an audience full of law professors. I'm guessing there are some questions. Oh, I'm sorry? Aaron. Oh, yeah. Oh, but it's a question of projecting into the internet.
Yeah, it's weird.
Who wants to respond to that? Or you all can.
Oh.
I can go first again.
Go for it.
Well, the first thing I would say is Kansas, right? That's an exciting story along those lines. But I do think that this is another place where congressional action is incredibly important. When Biden came into power, he talked about the importance of government actually doing things and actually solving people's problems. And when Congress is so dysfunctional and it's not doing that, I don't think the people writ large can see the possibility of what they might be able to get from their votes, from voting for the politicians who say they're going to do certain things. So, I mean, it's a little bit backwards, but I think more legislation, good or bad for that matter, as long as it stays away from the democratic process, is likely to be motivating to the people.
If I could just throw in one structural thing, and this my hobby horse was incentives. One exciting movement that is going on around the country is to rethink partisan primaries, because in so many places we have seen that the nationalized parties phenomenon is distorting the behavior of local parties. Local parties are more and more talking about national stuff instead of state stuff. And driven by the logic of brand differentiation, in order to win, they take ever more extreme positions on particular salient points, which gets them ever farther away from where your average voter is. how do they get away with this? What's the market response? Why is it working like this? Well, if you only have 20% of people who show up in primaries, then that's what you get. And then you get the generals, and people are like, well, I get this, or I get this. Ugh. And I think this structural problem, I'm glad to see that it's being addressed in various states, and we've got experiments going there, whether it involves rolling in ranked choice voting. But you've got to do something to pull the parties away from this logic of we can't be like those other guys who are bad, so we're going to take a very clear, different position from them and just play for those party primary people who show up to vote.
I mean, I think there's so much to say on this question. I guess the main point I would maybe emphasize is that we have seen a lot in recent years, increasingly, these struggles between efforts to mobilize direct democracy and the legislature trying to take away the power of direct democracy. And so that's one reason why, even though I think they're an imperfect, at best, actor, courts are really the only hope there with respect to restoring that power to the people and not allowing these legislative power grabs. That's sort of the example I was mentioning from Idaho, where you have referenda that sort of move beyond the normal partisan polarization, where the people of a state that we code as very red vote for things like Medicaid expansion, vote for teacher salaries, vote for things that sort of fall outside of this partisan division. And then the legislature wants to come in and say, oh, no, you can't do that. And in that case, again, the court stepped in to say, well, we seem to have this trend of the legislature trying to take away the people's power of initiative and referenda when they exercise it. And even though the legislature is coming in saying, as we see in these other states as well, what we're really trying to do is to protect vulnerable minorities, to protect people who need protection from mob rule or from the people running amok. That's not actually what's happening on the ground. And so in Idaho, again, the court could recognize that. We can see in other states, it's easy to see through that, even if the legislature is making such claims. But someone has to be willing to see through it. And if not, then those powers will be taken away, as we're seeing fights in Michigan right now, in Arizona, all sorts of places across the country.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think, I do want to shout, clear partisan choices are a really nice thing. And the classic now, it's like, a cliche thing to say, the 1950 American Political Science Association address is like, we really need clear partisan choices so voters can do it. And now, that interacts though with single member districts and electoral college, but even more so, I think the problem is the decentralized accountability structure of decentralized institutions where you lived through COVID, you're not liking how COVID is happening in your local jurisdiction. It's really a regular person has a viable pathway to thinking it was my outpartisan governor, it's my outpartisan mayor, it's actually the president I don't like. It's really, really hard for people who are living their daily lives to actually trace accountability through this highly decentralized structure. So I do think clear, salient issues, democracy performs a lot better when people understand an issue, see where authority is derived on that issue area, can make a clear decision, that then even sort of out-of-step policy offers a clear path towards democratic responsiveness. But it's a really tough thing. And I just think there's a lot, what do we do with that decentralized accountability? It's just hard to know. We're in a technological moment where information is nationalized. We're in a partisan moment where money, fundraising is national. Really, everything is national. I don't think we can put that back in the localism bag. Unfortunately, we just cannot roll that back. So finding new ways to create institutions that sort of match with this party system that I don't think's gonna go away. And we see this globally, sort of social polarization on sociocultural issues especially has really swept the world, and I don't think is going away. So we need institutions to be able to, address that and make clear decisions on the basis of popular sort of will.
largely behind a particular party, and that would create a dominant party for a period of time. That's stock in the 1960s. And it may be that electoral realignments are atheoretical, but they happen, right? They actually happen. So you could count on one party taking a dominant position for a long time. And I wonder, how does the failure now of electoral realignments, how does that affect this tit for tat issue? Is it correlation, or is there actual causation? The lack of an electoral realignment, or the expected electoral realignment, is actually affecting this unraveling of the norms. And why did the threat of an electoral realignment actually bolster these cooperative norms? I wonder if you might comment on that.
Wow. I think you've given me a research paper topic. No, that's a fantastic question. I guess when I was trying to think back to some of the realignments and Bull Moose Party, all these sorts of stuff coming back, one thing that feels different about that time is that the issues in the bag didn't include a lot of social stuff. And the social stuff, which is so tightly tied to personal identity. And, and then you talk about geographic self-sorting and other sorts of stuff. And I'm just kind of wondering if that's where the parties are getting a little bit stuck, where, number one, like I've said, they're playing for a smaller crowd, mostly, because they know ultimately it's going to be us versus them in the general. And our state is better, might be a little bit more acceptable. So as long as we don't run a spectacularly bad candidate, we're probably going to win. So all we have to do is make our brand please there. But then you add the identity stuff to it. And if that's your base, and your base is that identity, then you ain't leaving those people behind. And your flexibility to talk about other things, move into other things, I don't know, maybe that creates some sort of anchoring effect on the parties where they're just they're just stuck. Although, on a real national issue, trade, obviously the Republicans have gone from neoliberal to over there. They've got a schism. So that, you do have that sort of effect. I don't know. What do you think?
No, I think that's right. I'll put a slightly different spin on it, but it is clear. So Donald Trump accelerated and completed a trend that had been a generation long, which is the decoupling of economic performance locally and incumbent support in elections, right? Retrospective voting, that's like a classic. You're supposed to, in part, pick people based on policy views. You vote for the candidate closer to you on these policy issues, but then also you look back and, are you better off than you were 4 or 8 years ago was a very powerful thing in politics. 1932 is like a classic election. People are like, economic change needs to happen. That it has been entirely decoupled. There's really no Joe Biden actually picked it up a little, where there's a correlation between gas prices and approval, finally again a little bit, but it was a complete zero correlation under Trump. And that, unfortunately, I think is structural about issues like now we're getting into sort of groups and the economy and groups within society, where I do think theories of democracy really suggest comparative democratization literature on how democracies develop in wealthy societies and fall away, people like Levitsky and Ziblatt with How Democracies Die. This theory, it's really actually quite important and provocative that in highly economically unequal societies, the sort of business party, which even during, even given the trade protectionist move of the Trump administration, there were still the top two agendas in the Republican Congress policy issues were the high-end tax cut and the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. And you see Republican state legislatures rejecting free federal money for Medicaid expansion despite huge support from their populations. Then what do you do when you have an electorally unpopular economic agenda like this? The incentive is clearly to introduce other forms of conflict and play on, opposition to immigration, cultural change, right? And that has helped contribute to an entirely, now it's really sad, as when I do survey research now, the best predictors of people's vote choice, ordinary Americans' vote choice, is attitudes towards Colin Kaepernick and Lizzo playing the flute, James Madison flute, and is so much more predictive statistically than attitudes towards the minimum wage, universal health insurance, even climate change. This is not policy and material circumstances have been decoupled from elections. This is very destabilizing for mass democracy, and this helps explain the sort of in Republican primaries, the mass level opposition to democratic institutions. So I think this is really crucial. And when we think about this, we have to get into ideas of like the destruction of the labor movement in the U.S. from the mid-century, which helped, now a base of, mostly white, but some, people of color, non-college educated men often had an attachment to politics that was about, kitchen table issues and taxation and, relationships at the firm and with their boss. And now it's about essentially like, cultural iconography. And it's a really difficult thing to get out of. So we have to think about the connection between, these larger political economy and organizational issues and where the party positions stand. So anything that would bring back a sort of connection between vote choice and economic circumstances. It's really, I don't think it's a basic story of just straight up mass backlash to the civil rights movement. Like there's some of that, but I think it really interacts with this sort of elite strategy and the clear incentives of parties.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more question if one exists. Okay, then I will ask a final question, which is that in 2021 or so, we maybe came closer to enacting a really serious piece of federal election administration law with H.R. 1 and For the People, and For the People Act. And since we're here on a panel about federalism and sort of double-edged federalism, my question is, how should we think about the right way for Congress to get involved that still sort of maintains the kinds of benefits of federalism that we think exist? And maybe this is sort of a question for those of you who have some faith in the federal government. But is it something like H.R. 1, or is it something different? Is it something that might actually get passed?
Everybody's looking at me. All right.
Our leader. Yeah, you have good comments.
Thank you. I think I would say a couple of things. One is, in my mind, it is absolutely crucial that any federal legislation that passes be completely about making it easier for people to vote, making elections secure, and I am extraordinarily concerned about things like campaign finance reform being included in the legislation as it was in some of the, at least in some versions, for both practical and political reasons. The practical reason is I think the Supreme Court will strike down the campaign finance thing, and then they might decide it's not severable, and then everything is done. The more political reason is because I think that's a more it's more of a hot button issue. I mean, right now, democracy itself is obviously, unfortunately, a hot button issue, but I think it is possible to see, for people to see how it plays out in their communities, that there are actually elections that are going well, I hope. I mean, everything is contingent. That's how what I would encourage Congress to do.
Pass it down.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'd go back to, I'm biased. I'm fond of the Bipartisan Policy Center framework that we put out, which kind of said, hey, there's a grants and aid program, let's create it. And, grants will be given to help, states, communities hit basic standards, kind of floors for things like cybersecurity, voter access, how you count votes, foolish stuff like, voting, somebody sends in a ballot, you're not allowed to count it until the same day or the same evening as the election. I mean, that's just inviting. There's no sense in that sort of policy. It just creates mischief. So it would say, like, here are some of the things we just should not do. It's not overly prescriptive. It's not H.R. 1, and most certainly, I agree with you, throwing in campaign finance, forget about that. Keep it simple and keep it focused and keep it bipartisan by also including components that speak to the anxieties, whether you believe them or not, about election security.
I also, even though I didn't talk about Congress, I haven't given up on the federal government. So I think there is a role for federal legislation and certainly for imposing new floors of various kinds. But I would just emphasize
that when we have these conversations, we often talk as if there's either a federal response or a state response. And so people like Ted Cruz will shout about federalization no matter what. But what is probably most promising in this area, like most of our federal regulatory and social welfare programs, it's something that relies on both the federal government and the states. And so changing that allocation and providing a more robust role for the federal government seems correct to me, but that doesn't mean actually getting rid of the states or leaving them out. So it's thinking about how to build those relationships and how to have the federal government intervene without displacing the states, I think.
I endorse all of this.
Okay, we've come to the end. Thank you so much to the panel.